Hello, I'm Helena. What I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit esoteric in that most people kind of don't really understand that this is going on and don't understand how this is impacting young people to identify as trans or want to transition. So I think this will be really helpful to hear about for any clinicians or researchers or therapists who are out there working with these young people, because this definitely impacted my experience. And just from being in online trans communities, I know that this has impacted many, many, many other, especially young girls. What I'm going to be talking about today is fandom and how it relates to gender identity. So what on earth is fandom? Fandoms are basically communities, primarily online, although fandoms have existed before the internet. But now, when you say fandom, people mostly think online communities, devoted to discussing, celebrating, and creating content inspired by books, TV shows, movies, musical artists, or celebrities. It's not a casual thing. It's not like, you're kind of here and there looking at this stuff online. Most people who are participating in fandom, it's a huge part of your life. You're spending a huge amount of your waking hours perusing this kind of content and talking to other young people about your interests online. I was this 14-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, eighth grader. I was constantly looking online for new kinds of content. And I stumbled on a website called Tumblr. Tumblr has long been known for like one of the biggest hubs for fandom communities. And that's where I saw other people were posting about my interests. And I saw that most importantly, it was other teenage girls. So that really drew me in. I started posting immediately. I made an account. Other young girls started following me back, and I just like really took to it. And fandom was a huge, huge, huge part of my life up until I was about 18. So what are the key aspects of fandom culture? Because fandom culture is really it's known as being its own thing. It's kind of a very notorious thing online among young people. So this would be a constant stream of new art, fan fiction posts. People are really creating stuff. It's kind of a creative hub. It's where creative young people go to basically just create things. And it's usually kind of centered around this one strong interest they have in their life. Shipping, which is something that I will delve into a lot more later, which is basically, the short version of it is relationships between characters or celebrities that people are very interested in. There's this thing called headcanons. A headcanon is basically, interpreting a character or a aspect of a piece of media however you like. So I might have a headcanon that Harry Potter is Black or something like that, which he's not in the book, but in my headcanon he is. So it's like this personal interpretation, and it's a very major part of fandom culture. There are many sub-communities and sub-interests within a fandom. So you'll have different ships, communities. You'll have all sorts of just smaller enclaves within the larger umbrella where people can get together, and oftentimes it creates like an echo chamber effect where people are just very, very focused on a small, narrow group of things. There's this unrestrained creativity that I was kind of talking about before, where there's really no checks and balances. There's no kind of like social stigma against maybe going too far with certain ideas. It's just a lot of people really bonding over this kind of creativity and pushing the limits. And that creates some of the wilder aspects of fandom culture that do make it so notorious. And then lastly, it's usually a pretty obsessive thing. Like I said, it's not something where people are just kind of casually engaging with it. It's usually like these young people where they're very, very, very focused on a interest or a sub interest that they have, and they're just thinking about it all the time, talking about it all the time, and it's never really satiated. It's just constantly kind of there. So who is the most drawn to fandoms? The largest demographic would be adolescent girls, although there's also a decent proportion of maybe young adult women, so like early 20s, although it's much smaller than the adolescent girls. And then there's a very small percentage of like fully adult women. And then there's also a very, very small number of males of any age. It's really like it's an extremely, extremely female dominated aspect of the internet. It's mostly teenage girls who are very emotionally intense, creative, obsessive, introverted, and intelligent. So these are really girls who they don't want to have casual kind of relationships where you just talk about like what's going on at school or what's for homework. They want to have these intense relationships where you can really get into these interests that they have, and they want to just kind of be like following this fantasy dynamic and really engaging with this stuff and creating new ideas. So I mentioned this word earlier, shipping, and this is by far one of the most notorious aspects of fandom culture. It can get pretty crazy out there. A ship is short for a relationship. If I ship person A and person B, I like the idea of person A and person B being in a relationship together. I find that concept very interesting and captivating. The most popular ships and the vast majority of ships are male ships. And we're going to go into maybe why that is, some of my thoughts on why that is, because it is undeniable that the greatest focus is on the male ships. It's an infatuation with the fantasy of two people being in a romantic or sexual relationship. And it really is an infatuation. It's not just a casual thing of, oh, I think person A and person B would make a cute couple. It's really focusing on it. It's creating art of these two people together. It's writing fan fiction, oftentimes also erotica of these two people together, and it's a huge focus. It's just like an absolute infatuation with this idea of this relationship. It being a way to explore romantic and sexual themes and dynamics while maintaining a certain distance from it. This is usually really appealing to people who are intimidated by romance and sexuality in the real world, but they're also really craving that kind of intimacy and they're craving relationships. So they end up turning to this kind of shipping phenomenon because they're unable to meet those needs and satisfy those cravings in the real world. It's appealing to young girls and women who are very, very intensely attracted to boys or men, but they don't seek out relationships with male peers. And this might be because they're very shy. This might be because they have been hurt by males in the past, maybe abused or assaulted. So for whatever reason, they don't have these relationships with male peers. They're oftentimes very behind their other peers in terms of having those age-appropriate relationships. So you might have a girl who's 18, but has never even talked to like a boy ever. So you might be thinking, what the hell? Why is a heterosexual girl obsessed with gay male ships? Wouldn't she be more interested in male-female relationships because she's a female? She should be projecting herself onto a female in a relationship with a male. What's going on here? So I have a little bit of a pathway that I'm theorizing, where a young girl becomes infatuated with a male character or celebrity, and maybe even has a fantasy relationship with him in her head, and then feels intense resentment and even hatred at the canonical or real life romantic interests, female romantic interests of this male. And this you will see reflected in fandom communities. They're absolutely known to just freaking hate the female love interests of their favorite male celebrities or characters. these girls may feel insecure comparing themselves to this female love interest of their favorite male interest. They may look at, like, for example, you think of like a teenage girl, she's having a hard time adjusting, she's having a hard time socially, she's insecure, and then her favorite male celebrity is dating this gorgeous, beautiful bombshell celebrity woman. That creates just a lot of insecurity, and they really want that. They're having this fantasy relationship with this guy, and then they have this competition with this female, and it just creates so much insecurity. And like I said earlier, they may just be having a hard time adjusting to the complexity of maturing male-female relationship dynamics, where the idea of a male-female relationship gives them more anxiety than excitement or anything like that, where they don't want to be reading about male and female relationships because that's just really stressful. Going from there, some may start reading fan fiction about their favorite male celebrities or characters, and they may start out with reader fan fiction or ex-reader fan fiction, which is a second-person fan fiction, and it's aimed at being immersive to the reader. So it'll be like whoever celebrity kisses you on the lips or something like that. But it's known for not being very good. Like, it's just kind of poor quality. And somewhere along that line, they'll stumble onto the gay pairings, the male-male pairings. And these are usually third person, and they're usually much more well-written. And it can provide a vector for the girl to explore relationships and sexuality with the male objects of her infatuation without confronting all that resentment and insecurity and hatred and self-doubt that is triggered by female love interests and male-female relationships. Erotic or romantic erotic scenarios that don't include women, because women cause all of those aforementioned negative feelings of insecurity, especially in like an erotic context. If the young girl in question is very insecure about her body, like thinking about a situation with her, male celebrity interest in an erotic situation with a very attractive woman, like that is just painful to these young girls. And instead, when it's two men, it can be just very seductive because they love men and they don't want to see the women. And it's just kind of like this weird perfect storm for them. So what does this all have to do with gender and gender identity? So to begin, I will just say that in fandom communities, the absolute vast majority of adolescent girls are identifying as some form of trans. So there is a strong correlation. It's very popular. And part of this has to do with the shipping, the headcanons, the fantasy, and the other part has to do with the fact that fandom communities are very strongly into this kind of social justice worldview. It's super, super prominent. So any fandom community, it's going to have that hierarchy of, if you are a cis het white person, you're evil, you're terrible, you're horrible, you're disgusting, you're an oppressor, you are just the worst thing that has ever been put on earth. And then on the other side, if you're trans, if you're gay, if you're not white, then you are amazing and everybody needs to be super nice to you and all that kind of stuff. The LGBT spectrum is really elevated in these fandom communities. And part of that is because of that love of the male-male pairings, where these girls are just really obsessed with the very idea of gay men. And they almost think it's like they're being like pro-LGBT by sharing this like gay fan fiction. These young girls, they're really experiencing their relationship fantasies as being between two boys, and they're developing an aversion to male-female relationships. And kind of in this environment, especially with that kind of social justice hierarchy that says that being trans and being a gay boy is so much better than being a boring old oppressive cisgender straight girl, they can really start to overly identify with the gay ships and that kind of dynamic. And it can be in this environment where there's no checks and balances on the fantasy, and it's just all these young girls identifying as trans together, shipping these ships together, talking about this all together. It's just so easy to kind of have your identity lines so blurred and to start to overly identify with being a quote gay trans boy. And then the headcanons also like really come into play here, because you can have a character and then you can maybe relate to that male character, but you are molding that character to be how you want him to be. And oftentimes there will be kind of a like a blurring of the lines between what is that fan's personal identity about themselves and what is their headcanon of their favorite character. So that's kind of, if you take away anything from this presentation, just think about these are young girls who are engaging in so much fantasy. It's really geared towards loving boys, celebrating boys. Social justice tells them that being a cis straight girl is a terrible, disgusting thing. They feel insecure about being girls. They think being a boy would be so much better. Being a boy is so much more exciting. They don't have to confront all of those insecurities that they have about relationships between men and women. And it's just so easy for the fantasy to take over. When you're in the real world and maybe you're role playing with your friends on the playground and one of you plays the role of Superman, you can pretend to be Superman all you want, but you'll never be able to fly. Whereas in these online communities, it's almost as if you can fly, because you're not doing the role playing in the real world, you're doing it online. There's so much fantasy, you're lost connection with the real world peers and your physical body. So it's just, it becomes very real. So imagine an adolescent girl who is obsessed with an attractive male character, simultaneously is feeling affection for him and exploring relationship ideas through him as a vector with other men, and also wants to emulate him. And then gender ideology comes along and says, this is all a sign that you're trans. This is all a sign that deep down, you really want to be a boy. And I'll give you all an example of what that kind of looks like. So this is a Tumblr post, and it has 72,000 plus notes, which is like impressions, that's likes and retweets. And it says something that bears mentioning. I get why we need to shame straight girls who fetishize MLM, that means male loving male ships. But to any straight girls who consistently relate to or resonate with male loving male dynamics on a deep level, or see themselves in queer male characters, if by any chance this post from a tiny, tiny blog crosses your dashboard, please take this moment to very privately consider the possibility that you might not be straight or a girl. And this is so freaking pervasive. This is everywhere. And by the possibility that you might not be straight, that's not saying that she could be a lesbian. That's saying that she could be a gay boy. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys. Some stuff to think about. If you have a client or a child who is very into fandom, this is kind of like what they're experiencing. And this post that I have right in front of you, that's just one really good example that I felt like kind of ticked all the boxes for what I'm trying to explain to you guys. But this is not the only post. It's a culture. It's an entire culture of, you know, being obsessed with boys in this very unique way, and then being told that that makes you trans. So yeah, that is all I have for you guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something, and I hope this didn't just go completely over your heads.
That was amazing, Helena. Really, really amazing. I'd say everybody has so many questions, we don't really know where to start.
Yeah, everybody probably is like, what the fuck?
I might just ask you just a couple of questions and then we'll roll into the panel discussion. Is your kind of thesis that this is kind of a female sexuality that is kind of falling all over the place effectively online?
Yeah, I think this is like, I wouldn't say it's a female sexuality, because now that I'm like I used to be very into this like gay shipping stuff when I was a teenager. And now that I'm older and like more comfortable with my body and in a real relationship, like I'm not interested in that whatsoever. It was very much something when I was younger. So I don't think it's like asexuality, but
Oh, sorry, yeah. I mean, a
yeah, but
developing sexual expression or a
yeah,
developing sexual curiosity or something.
I think it's like it stems from things that are developmentally normal for certain adolescent girls with certain personality styles and maybe certain life experiences. Yeah, but it just kind of, because there's no restraints and there's just so much fantasy involved and it's so disconnected from the real world, it just kind of spins out of control. But I think at its core, it is like developmentally normal.
And it reminds me, like, it just reminds me, I don't know whether this sounds ridiculous, but like I think of, you know, Frank Sinatra's Bobby Socks or whatever they were, and the Beatles and all those girls screaming at all those concerts, and they had lost it. And in the
Yeah.
70s, those girls, and they were just literally insane. And I remember hearing about girls kissing posters all the time. And it feels incredibly similar.
It
But
is similar.
yeah.
I definitely think that's kind of it's definitely a phenomenon that has been present. I'm sure, I mean, in like Roman times, there were women who were doing this about gladiators. Like I think it's kind of it's a normal aspect of female sexuality and like romantic interest. But I think it goes like beyond normal when there's just no kind of like connection to the real world, when you're just spending so much time online and not really having real relationships.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of girls, I think they start off with like being obsessed with, you know, somebody from a pop band, and then they move on in an ideal world into that.
Yeah.
Nice to see Detrans Awareness Day is trending on Twitter. Great.
Nice.
Yay! Can we take a moment? That's great news. But I do think that the big difference is there isn't doctors ready to medicalize that in any other generation. And this is
absolutely. And that's really what I'm trying to convey. Like, I literally guarantee you that if you took a pool of all the adolescent girls who are, you know, trying to transition right now, and you look through their social media, you would see, God, especially out of the heterosexual ones or even the bisexual ones, you would see a vast majority who are in fandom culture and they're engaging in this like shipping stuff. But it's like the clinicians, they don't realize that, they don't know about this. And so you're really like, you're medicalizing something that is so kind of like, you're making something permanent and physical and real, which is in essence a very kind of like fantasy, like developmental adolescent kind of fantasy, like romantic exploration.
Wow.
And that's definitely what happened to me.
Yeah, it seems to be
Yeah.
very clear. Well, we welcome in the panel discussion, Detrans 101, what you need to know. I know Helena, Sinead, Grace and Carol are going to be part of this, so you can unmute yourselves. And I suppose the big concept, and anybody else who wants to join in, make your voice known, please do. But yeah, the big question for this is what each of you want people to know. What do people need to know about detransition? And you know, it can go any which way. So maybe Sinead, would you kick it off? You look like you're ready with something to say. Go on then.
Just the face I have, Stella. I mean, I think one thing that we really do need to get out of the way initially is that I think most of the people that are here detransition because of transition regret related issues, but obviously that's not the only reason why people detransition. And I know we're going to get hit with that, so I'll just go ahead and get that out of the way. There's so many reasons why people detransition. Sometimes, you know, well, in fact, we'll go with the studies. We'll go with the Lisa Lippman study and the Ellie Vandenbush study. The most common reasons for detransitions in those instances was realizing that your gender dysphoria was related to other issues. It was due to health concerns that would come with the steps of transition. And it was also due to, very commonly, I don't know if it was the most common, but very common, was realizing that internalized homophobia or misogyny had something to do with it. But there's also people who detransition indeed because of transphobia and because of discrimination and things like that. There's lots of reasons. And so what detransition is, in its simplest boiled down component, is someone who has began medical transition and for a reason decided to cease that. But for me, I mean, I think what we would be talking about today, what I would like the people listening to hear about today, is it's not just ending the medical process, it's also returning to a previous identity. And in a lot of cases, I won't speak for anyone here, but I know you're probably very much on the same page as me, it's giving up the trans identity, you know? So at one point, everyone thinks about the hormones and the surgeries and things like that. That's not the whole point. The internal process that you go through is huge, and it can rule your life. It's like for me, and it was an obsession for years. And so detransition for me wasn't just stopping cross-sex hormones and stuff like that. It was letting go of a mindset that I had adopted where I believed that I wasn't a woman. So I think sort of to kick things off, if anyone else would like to jump in and say anything else, is detransition is a lot of different things, but what's the baseline? That's mine.
Whoa.
So,
Come on in, Carol.
okay. So for me, I really think the core to detransition is a recognition of reality again. It's a recognition of your reality and just of the reality. And your reality is, I'll speak from my perspective. My reality was that I was a woman. I was female. My reality was that I was a lesbian. My reality was I am a butch lesbian. All those things I ran from since I was a kid and never had it addressed and never dealt with those issues. And the trans identity that I was really had the brain of a man in a woman's body just fits so nicely, because I mean, if you look at the DSM, what's most of the criteria? It's your likes, your dislikes, how you dress, just all those very really superficial things. And butch lesbians especially, we tick so many of those boxes, and we always have from such a young age. It is no wonder so many of us has fallen into trans ID and in transition. But for me, the core of it is acknowledging your reality and being humble about it, and then moving forward from there.
It strikes me as it's a loss of faith, though, because if you've believed something and then you don't, you're kind of in a very, I would imagine, a shaky place.
It's painful. It's very painful to the beginning.
It's that feeling, isn't it, where you find out detransition is an option, but you're so afraid to do it, and it takes such a long time to be able to admit to yourself that you were wrong, because it's embarrassing, and you feel ashamed and you feel guilty, and in many cases you lose all the friends that you had because all your friends are trans, and then you detransition and you're seen as a heretic somewhat. And you don't want to detransition. You don't want to admit that you were wrong. You don't want to be a woman with a beard or a man with breasts. You don't want to lose all your friends. You don't want people to be hostile to you and accuse you of being a bigot, while you're also dealing with transition regret, which, as many of you here know all too well, it's a living hell, especially when none of your therapists or counselors will listen to you, especially when you do actually find someone who isn't completely against detransition and their response is, maybe you're gender fluid, maybe you're non-binary. It's so, detransition isn't fun and it's not enjoyable. And I completely understand why so many people lost in transition say it took me a year, 2 years, 5 years, because why the hell would you want to do it sooner?
I knew for a year before I actually stopped the process that I'd made a mistake. I couldn't bring myself, I really, the biggest part was I couldn't tell my family that. I put them through so much. I couldn't go, it seems so ridiculous to go, oops, I made this huge goddamn mistake. And that was devastating. That was the hardest thing. If it would just been me, would have been much easier, in my opinion, for me. But the impact it had on my family was horrible.
Could I ask, when you said there was a year, did you continue to take the hormones for a year or yeah.
Yep.
I done that as
I did.
well. I think that's
Did
actually
you?
quite common. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
I knew I became gender critical. I became critical of the whole thing. But I continued taking the hormones because I felt really stuck. I didn't know what to do.
Wow.
And I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to go. Where do I go? I didn't know anybody who detransitioned. I hadn't heard even about it. And I had brought it up to my therapist many times when I had been seeing her that I had questions, I had concerns, and she didn't want to talk about it. I could definitely tell she didn't want to talk about it. So we never talked about it.
What do you think, Grace?
Yeah, I think the piece about it being not just a loss of like your, like dealing with the medical changes, but also dealing with an entire context of your personal life and your belief system is really, really painful. And I think it is very understandable to me that like Sinead and Carol stayed transitioning for some time after some part of them had realized it was a mistake, because there's so much like cognitive dissonance already, at least that I was experiencing through the whole process. And also, there's a lot of stuff within trans culture that's about managing that, like about like soothing the worry that you might not be trans, or like, being like, no, 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 you are valid, like it's real. And it's which to me says that a lot of trans people struggle with these sorts of doubts and like confusion, and then to push through that and slowly be having the realization that it might be wrong dawning on you, and like desperately not wanting it to be true, is extremely painful. And I think often I'd be curious how often people feel this way. I think there's often just some sort of like moment of like undeniability that I hear detransitioners talking about, like some sort of like, oh fuck moment, just being like, I can't deny it anymore. I don't know. I remember lying awake one night and like being unable to sleep, and just having all my doubts just crashing down upon me, and just kind of throwing up the white flag, being like, okay, I accept it. Like I ruined my life. This was wrong. And it was devastating, but I couldn't deny it anymore. It was very powerful. So yes, so detransition is hard, and it's not just about the medical stuff.
Is there anything anybody can do if you see somebody who seems to be lost in transition and could be having those dark nights of the soul in the middle of the night? You can almost see it that they would be having it. I wonder, is there anything you can say to them?
They need a therapist that will listen to them. If you go to your therapist and say that you're starting to struggle with some feelings of regret, and maybe you don't use the word detransition, maybe you say something instead like, I'm considering going back, quote unquote, your therapist should be able to listen to that. What they shouldn't do is say, well, maybe it's because you have another identity, maybe it's because of transphobia, maybe it's because of discrimination. And all the 5 years that I was trans identified, I never once experienced transphobia. I was celebrated and I was held up as beautiful and brave. Never once did I experience discrimination until I detransitioned. And the first people to treat me poorly were my therapists, because they just didn't want to speak about detransition. I needed help. I'm so fortunate that I have wonderful friends and family, including many of the people attending this that I've spoken to. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have anyone when those therapists done that, because you're already at rock bottom. And when you hear a certifiable or whatever qualified mental health professional being like, I don't know what detransition is, like it's a kick in the stomach. It really, really feels bad.
Whoa.
I hate to say this, because I was at one point on track to become a therapist. I really believed in the mental health field. And this whole experience, it's weird for me to say this, but I would really tell somebody to not go to a therapist, not seek it, because I tried every therapist I could under my insurance, and everyone was horrible to me, because I came in angry. At the time, I was very angry. I was angry that I felt lied to. I felt betrayed. I felt that a lot of homophobia had taken place on from everybody, but definitely from the therapist I had at the time. And I got one therapist actually tried to convince me that I was not correct in my assumption of what was going on, and that she knew for a fact that transition was excellent because she was actively transitioning a 4-year-old girl. I lost it with her. I yelled at her. I gave her hell. And I felt, you know what? She fucking deserves it. And I walked out and I sat in my truck and I sobbed. I broke down like you would not believe. I had shaking. I had to call my wife and she had to talk me through it so I could drive home. It was fucking devastating. And
Whoa.
I will, yeah, so I wonder, I would say, try to find some community, try to find some other detransitioners. You know, if you start becoming active in some of these communities, you will find, in my opinion, more help than you ever will from a therapist. Unless you can find a therapist you know is going to be supportive. And I'm not saying they're not out there. Obviously, here's Stella, but they are hard to find.
Well, I'll back you up. I became a therapist because I trailed around in my 20s, going from what I believe were one terrible therapist to the next. And I suppose the big difference is I think so many of us are messed up and screwed up in our teenage years and in our 20s. It's part of it. That's what we are. But the big, huge difference, I might have got crap therapists, but they weren't telling me to go off and do some sort of medical thing. You know, the big, huge difference is the specter of you know, surgery and hormonal interventions that just was just a huge layer of difference for you guys. Helena, you look like you were going to come in there on something there a minute ago. You're not so
I was
sure.
just kind of agreeing about the bad experiences with therapists. And I guess like something that I was actually talking about on Twitter last night, because I was getting in my feelings about it, was
Yeah.
how if anybody's like unfamiliar with my story, when I was on testosterone, I actually had just like a very bad reaction to it. And it gave me just some really terrible mental health symptoms that actually put me in a danger to myself and others. And I was hospitalized twice in like a mental health hospital over this. And like my entire experience with every mental health professional that I had during the years that I was trans, like none of them even mentioned the testosterone might be an issue. Like that was never, they diagnosed me with a bunch of different mental illnesses and prescribed me 4 different freaking psychiatric drugs, which like I was in such a bad place, I ended up abusing some of them. And like, it was just like a total fucking disaster in my life. Absolutely such a dark time. But it's like, what the hell is our mental health institution? It's not like, and I've said before, like, it's not like it's just one psychiatrist or one therapist who did this. It's freaking everybody. It was everybody at the hospital. It was everybody at my outpatient program. I probably interacted with like 10 different psychiatrists, like,
Wow.
and nobody ever brought up that, oh, okay, you're an 18-year-old girl on 100 milligrams a week of testosterone. Maybe this is causing your breakdowns. No, it was just, I was just told I was mentally ill and I needed to be on 4 different medications for life.
Oh my God. And from what I can remember of you, you were in at 18 and you said to the nurse, as if you were the doctor, oh, I've low estrogen, give me top dose. And they did. Is that right, Helena?
Yeah, and that's what happened at my appointment when I went to get the testosterone when I was 18. Like she was gonna start me on a lower dose, but then I, just being like so naive and ignorant, I said like, oh, well, I want to go on a higher dose because I think that I have extra estrogen, so I'm gonna need more testosterone to like give me the body that I want. And she was basically just like, okay. And then we had a conversation and she ended up prescribing me 100 milligrams, which is on the higher end of what people usually start out with. Some people might end up at 100 milligrams after moving up from a lower dose, but like to start on 100 milligrams is kind of, I haven't met anybody else who has had that experience, at least.
And you're
Can I
not.
just ask,
Oh,
Helena, like, did you inject your own testosterone or did you have to get it injected by a nurse?
I injected it,
And they just gave you the full vial and were like, here you go.
basically. And I remember like I was so like, oh my God, I was just so naive and just like not in a good place. So I would like fill up the vial even more, just being like, oh, I just need more testosterone because it's like I hate my body so much. I just want it to change. I just need more testosterone. So I was probably injecting like Lord knows how much testosterone.
Wow.
Yeah, I did the
Yeah.
exact same thing because initially when I got my vial, my testosterone was sustained in 250, and they were like, we're going to give you the whole vial, but you're only supposed to inject half. But of course, I was out of my damn mind. I was like, more testosterone will make me a man quicker. So of course I was
Yeah.
injecting. Like there was no supervision. There was no
Yeah.
like, and then you'd go for your blood work and they'd be like, everything looks fine. Do you want a higher dose? Even though your mental health is plummeted. And it was like,
Yeah.
on paper, it was like we saw this patient and spoke to this patient, but in the actual appointment, there was nothing. There was no safeguarding, there was no care, there was no inspection, there was nothing. And I think, you know, people will bring out these files in these studies where it's like, we saw these patients and we spoke to them and we had all these appointments. If you actually speak to the people who attended them, it was like there was no medical questions. I used to go for my blood checks and she'd be like, how's uni going? I'm like, fine. She's like, right, see you in a couple of months. That's all it was. There was no intense mental health check or talk therapy. It didn't happen.
I didn't even get blood work when I was prescribed testosterone. They didn't even test my blood hormones or anything. They were just like, okay, here you go. And they said that like, because the clinic that I went to was a Planned Parenthood, their official policy was to, for the first appointment, they take the blood work and then they wait for the blood work to come back. And then you come in to get your first injection after a week or two. But they were like, oh, you seem so sure and you've come such a long way that we're just going to not do the blood work because it's not necessary anyway. And also here's this massive dose of testosterone.
Yeah, my
Carol, what were you
experience
gonna
was
say?
the same, pretty much with testosterone. And Planned Parenthood was my provider, and they are the biggest provider in the United States of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like they
Grace?
gave me a 3-month supply, just like a vial
Yep.
that was a 3-month supply. So there's no like, there's like, and there was no follow-up either. Like I had a phone call follow-up 2 weeks after the appointment, but after that, I just never heard from them again. So it's like, yeah, that's just kind of the average Planned Parenthood experience.
I went into Planned Parenthood for about a year, 2 or 3. I was having really bad vaginal atrophy, and I went in to Planned Parenthood to get care for that. And they basically said they'd never heard of such a thing. They didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And they said, here, we're going to get you some information. And they went and they got me a number to a plastic surgeon to get genital reconstruction surgery or whatever, basically to get lower surgery, to get sex change surgery. And I was like, oh, this is not helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I wasn't even told about vaginal atrophy or anything either.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Neither was I.
That wasn't mentioned.
And yet it's a very common feature. What about yourself, Grace?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so just talking about like people feeling, scared to go back to therapists and like doctors, like it's a huge feeling of institutional betrayal. That's this phrase that people use for like, betrayal from something bigger than just one person. It's like this whole system, like Helena said. And I got informed consent hormones. I, checked off my informed consent checklist, but I went back later and I was like, hey, so I read like the most widely used standards of care, which are the WPATH standards of care. And they said that you're supposed to provide all these assessments for like autism and eating disorders and depression and stuff. And they really recommend that you offer all this stuff. Like you said, you follow WPATH, like, why didn't you do any of this for me? Or why didn't you at least tell me about it? Like, what is going on here? And they were just like, well, we just would rather really err on the side of not doing that. I was like, okay, great. Well, thanks for nothing, I guess. Like, just is so frustrating because, you're realizing that these providers are basically, they're very ideologically captured. They think that they're doing the right thing, but they're making these choices to do absolutely nothing in the way of mental health support. And you know, it's shocking to see it rolled out on such a wide scale after I've been hurt by it and seen other people hurt by it as well.
Well, there's no money to be made off of offering people mental health.
Yeah. Like, can you all remember the first time you went to a therapist or a counselor and brought up, or even just insinuated that you were dealing with transition regret? Can you remember their faces? Because I remember mine. Like, you go in and you're like, I'm starting to have some doubts, and the wall came up, and you're like, you're supposed to be a clinically neutral health provider. What, you know, I, to this day, I'm not including you, Stella, because I haven't like been to you as a patient. You know, I've been spoken to you and blah, blah, blah. But I've never visited a hospital or my GP or the health group that I was referred to. I've never went for treatment, and so far, not yet, I haven't met someone that wasn't ideologically captured. And I've been detransitioned for over 2.5 years. It's just not there.
This is a broken system. This whole gender therapist, if you want to call them that, whatever the hell they are, it's just broken. It's not working. It's not serving people. It's not looking after people at all. To finish this part of the discussion, is there anything you would like to say that you think people need to know? I'll just ask each one of you. Is there anything you'd like to say that you think people need to know about detransition, or what is important, or maybe a myth that needs to be exploded, anything like that? Yeah, Carol?
So I think the biggest takeaway with transition regret, if you're detransitioning because of regret, is that the person, that transition was traumatic for them. That whole transition and the detransitioning is going to be, might be one of the most traumatic things they've ever been through. And that has to be acknowledged, and that has to have that kind of care from mental health professionals and from doctors. That has to be understood. You can't just you know, slap a new pair of tits on them and send them out the door. That's not gonna help, you know, which is the answer I got from Kaiser. I said, I want to detransition, and you guys gave me the shit, and I want you to go ahead and you basically fix it, kind of. And without batting an eye, well, we can get you in for breast reconstruction. No, I don't want that, you know.
Wow.
So I mean, it really is. It's, yeah, they think they can just, you know, like you're you know, Mr. Potato Head here. We can just, you know, put on some new parts and you're good to go. It's not. It's a trauma. It is a trauma that you're going to carry with you the rest of life. That doesn't mean you're not going to heal from it. It doesn't mean you're not going to be much happier down the road, because I am, but it's still there. Still something you went through.
Utter betrayal.
I'll go next if you want. I think, like, for me, if I was able to sit down with a large group of people who were in the mental health or medical field, or the people who actually had a say in what they did with people like us, as much as I would love them to know a lot about detransition, and certainly in the coming years, they're going to have to, they're not going to have a choice about that. But if I had things my way, I would go back into the past and I would talk about preventative techniques. You know, there's been so many people who've transitioned who they shouldn't have. They shouldn't have been facilitated in that. We're examples here. And so for me, I think it would be when you have, for example, a young woman who is struggling with a plethora of other issues. Maybe she's depressed, maybe she's anxious, maybe she's struggling with other things like eating disorders and things like that. How could you possibly look at a young woman with all of these issues and decide to just put them aside because gender's been put on the table, and hand this young woman irreversible cross-sex hormones? How could you do that in good conscience? I don't understand. And I know that everyone's being fed this stuff about trans is beautiful and brave and stunning, and it's your authentic self. Yeah, if you actually have gender dysphoria, but what about the absolutely massive surge that we've seen? Even GIDS themselves in the UK have had to come out and admit that this is an absolutely unprecedented surge. They've never seen it. It was always a very small group of older men, and now you're seeing this abundance of teenage girls and young women, many of whom are lesbian or gay, many of whom are autistic, many of whom come from foster care, and a whole host of other stuff. How dare you? How dare you sit those women down and hand them cross-sex hormones and double mastectomies as if that's nothing? So I think rather than telling people this is how you treat detransitioners, I want that. But I don't want more detransitioners. I want less. And in order for that to happen, we actually need to treat people with gender dysphoria properly. And the affirmative model that we've adopted so far is disgusting. And that's what needs to change.
Well,
Wow, can we get a round of applause here?
you got me there. You got me. What about Grace? Would you like to say something? And then after that, Helena. And then we'll move on to Ali and her piece.
Yeah, I would just say if you are a detransitioner or have a detransitioner in your life, I know how completely, shattering an experience it can be, and how it can feel like your life is ruined. And I think that everyone here has probably struggled with those feelings to some extent, but I definitely know that there is life after detransition. As Carol said, it's something that you'll carry with you forever, but I never want to see someone like succumbing to despair. So I just think that, especially given that institutions are so ideologically captured on this issue, it's just really important that, people try to be there for each other and to support the detransitioners in their life through what's probably a really hard time, and to just try to hold out hope, because I truly believe that you can recover from it.
Oh, that's lovely. And Helena?
A big point of mine is just kind of what my presentation was about, where we are really, as someone very aptly put it in the chat, someone said doctors are concretizing transient obsessions. And that is very true, I think, for many of us here, where really we were either very young or in a vulnerable point in our lives, and we just got hooked on this idea, whether it's because we watched YouTube videos or we read too much gay fan fiction or whatever. We just kind of got hooked on this idea that we were always meant to be boys or girls, and all of our problems stem from the fact that we were assigned the wrong gender at birth, and it's all going to be amazing, and we're going to have trans joy when we transition. And like, you're just like, when you transition a person like that, like, you are making something concrete, you are damaging them, you are harming them for life based on something that they would have grown out of or overcome without like the permanent damage. So
Brilliant, thank you. Before I welcome in Ali for her presentation, and thank you very much for this Detrans 101. I think it was very, very powerful from all of you. I think you're all right about the therapists. I think you have been failed by the medical profession. And I think it's easy for somebody like me who was so mad so many different times in my life. And, I've always known, the mind can make a hell, a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven. There's no doubt about it. And we can every one of us can get stuck on things. And it's just so unfair that your stuck got interpreted into a medical situation that, you just didn't. It wasn't fair.